When modern people nowadays think of elves, they probably think either of elves as portrayed in the Lord of the Rings films, or maybe they think of the North Pole. To the early medieval English, what was an elf?
Yeah, and the Lord of the Rings reference is quite an interesting one, actually, in that when Tolkien portrays elves, he's normally portraying them from their own point of view. So, like in the Silmarillion, elves are just the main characters. And even in the Lord of the Rings, the hobbits are actually meeting elves and hanging out with them. So we kind of see the world from the elves' point of view. But there's a brief moment in the Lord of the Rings when Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas are chasing off after the kidnapped
Hmm.
Pippin and Merry, and they meet the riders of Rohan, the Rohirrim, and Eomer, the leader of these, pseudo Anglo-Saxon characters, says, "So where have you been?" And Aragorn's like, "Oh, we've been hanging out with the elves in Lothlorien," and Eomer is like, "What? You were hanging out with the Lady of the Wood?" And I think we get a glimpse there into Tolkien's quite perceptive um, imagining of how Anglo-Saxons saw elves as these human-like, dangerous people who lived in the woods next door, who you don't want to hang out with, really. So that's a kind of Lord of the Rings way into answering that question. But if it's okay, I'll just go back in time a little bit to what people thought elves were before I was kind of doing my main research on this about 20 years ago, if that's okay. And then I'll
Oh, for sure, for sure.
sort of say what I think is going on. So in during the 20th century, people picked up, like scholars, picked up the idea that for the people that we might call Anglo-Saxons or the speakers of Old English, the inhabitants of early medieval English-speaking Britain. For those people, um, elves were these little demonic sprite type things that might cause illness. Um, and there wasn't really any evidence for that, but the idea kind of took hold, and people sort of imagined that that's what was going on. Um, but and one reason why it's possible to think that is that we've got very little direct, neat evidence for an early medieval English elf. There are no pictures of them, as far as we know. Our texts mention them fragmentarily, and there are no kind of neat, tidy stories about elves as such. So it was possible to think that they might be these little sprites that cause disease. But when you look around at other evidence, I think that's quite unlikely. So when we get to the early modern period, around like the 16th century in Scotland, we get really rich evidence for local elf beliefs in English-speaking Scotland. And elves are definitely human-sized people who kind of, live in the woods or the mound or something, near your farm. If you kind of trespass onto their territory, perhaps unwittingly, they might take revenge by afflicting your cattle or you with illness. You might also have sexual encounters with elves. Um, and so that's definitely going on, in early modern Scotland. And then if we go a bit earlier into high medieval romance, again, fairy knights, human-sized, they look like people, are the kind of people you might run into in a wood if you're a kind of lost maiden and they might have sex with you. And contemporary with Anglo-Saxon England, we've also got early medieval Irish evidence for these human-like, human-sized people, the ice sheather, the people of the mounds who live next door to everyday people, or even in, say, Arabia, the Quran has lots of material, or quite a lot of material, about jinn. Again, human-like, human-sized people who live next door to everyday people and might have sex with them and cause illness. And I'm pretty sure that's what's going on in early medieval England. Insofar as we've got kind of smoking gun evidence for that, and this is a pretty feeble smoking gun, but the strongest Old English evidence that we have for that is that the word elf in Old English is attested in the plural form once in Beowulf. Oh no, yes, sorry, it's
Right, Ylve.
Ulva. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Once in Beowulf. Um, and the ending there, which is so nicely articulated, spelt with the letter E, is an ending which you only find in plural words when they are ethnonyms, that is, names of peoples. Um,
Oh, I've never considered that.
yeah, the weird long-stemmed I-stem declension for the super nerdy. listeners. Um, so in Old English, this plural E ending, which is very unusual in masculine nouns in Old English, is used specifically for ethnonyms, names for peoples. So Saxa, Saxons, Engla, the English. Um,
Right, the
uh,
proposed emendation for the sixth line of Beowulf, Exoda Erle, also draws from
oh,
that idea that that E ending, that maybe it was an E ending, and the scribe just kind of confused it and thought it was dative, and that was a mistake and blotted it out.
100%. Wow, that is some intense Beowulf emendation knowledge. Yes. So we've only got this one attestation of the word elf in the plural, in the nominative or accusative plural, I should say, in Old English. But it looks like it's in this declension that's used for ethnonyms, and that suggests that elves are viewed as being like people, or even they are people, in a worldview that doesn't kind of view supernatural beings as fiction. Elves are these people who live next door. So that's what I think elves were for, early medieval English speakers. Um, these supernaturally powerful folk who were otherwise like humans, but who you didn't really want to tangle with. Yeah.
That's the Jin connection is really fascinating to me. Do you then suggest that this is really a Proto-Indo-European kind of mythological idea that goes all the way back to the first couple Indo-European cultures?
Um, I wouldn't want to try and pin this on Indo-European culture specifically, partly because I just don't know enough,
Mhm.
but partly because human-like supernatural beings are just really common around the world. And actually, Arabic language examples could be quite pertinent there. So the Semitic languages, Arabic is a Semitic language, are not in the Indo-European family, though it's plausible that they have a kind of yet more ancient common ancestor. And yet these different language groups still produce beliefs in human-like supernatural beings who are a sexual threat and a health threat. So I suspect it's just a widespread kind of Eurasian or even beyond, but a widespread Eurasian idea that we just see manifesting in the Old English speaking world under the name elves.
Right. And it makes sense if they are humanoid, that is like human size, it makes sense that we would have, Spencer writing about them, Chaucer, not Chaucer, well, yes,
Yeah,
Chaucer, and
Chaucer as
also
well. Yeah.
Shakespeare writing them as like actual characters that interact kind of face to face with real humans. So that is pretty interesting. When I first read the title of your book, I assumed that it would be something like a book of facts about elves. But what really struck me was the education that the reader gets in the way one ought to treat with Germanic mythology. Can you explain the difference that you elucidate between like the otherworldly, the supernatural, and the monstrous there, between perhaps like the elves and the giants, maybe?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was reading a review of a more recent kind of fairy book recently. Oh, embarrassingly, I've forgotten the author's name. Oh no, Jeremy Hart has just published one. It's not
Okay.
his that I'm trying to think of. It's a Cambridge University Press one. Anyway, I'll try and look it up in due course.
I'll
But
include it in the description as well if you do
oh,
get that
that'd
to
be
me.
nice. Yeah. But the review of that book mentioned my book, and it basically said that my book is mostly source criticism. Like it says little about elves. It says a lot about the problems with the source material, and I think that's
I
very fair.
see.
So yeah, in that sense, the book is kind of a study of what can we know and how can we know it about kind of non-Christian traditional belief in early medieval Northwest Europe. But yeah, one of the ideas that I latched onto was that we know that Old English speakers have all sorts of words for supernatural beings. We don't often know very much about precisely what those words mean, but we know the words are out there and we know they must mean something. Um, and I was trying to find kind of conceptual frameworks for understanding our quite fragmentary evidence. Um, and one of the things that seems fairly clear is that one or two words for supernatural beings, traditional non-Christian supernatural beings, were words that you could associate with everyday people, and then some of them were words that you can't. So the word elf and the word that in Old English is Ors, which seems to mean some kind of pagan god. In modern Icelandic, that's Aus. Um, that those words turn up in personal names. So you get people called Alfred. Famously, etymologically, it means elf advice. Um, and you get people called Oswald, meaning kind of god power or something like that. And you get the word God itself, in names like Godwin. So people were happy to name people using those words for supernatural beings. And those words for supernatural beings also are words that you might use metaphorically in Old Norse poetry to talk about people. Um, but we've got all these other Old English words for supernatural beings, like thyrfs. It's not a word that we use now, but it was there at the time. Dweorg, which we have as dwarf. Um, got all these other words that don't turn up in people's names that you don't compare people with in Old Norse poetry and so forth. So it seemed to me that we had to find a distinction within the category of supernatural beings between supernatural beings that might be dangerous and might cause illness and might be a threat, but nonetheless you might want to compare yourself to, or your kids to, or whatever, and supernatural beings that you don't want to compare yourself to. And so I used this term otherworldly for elves and gods who seem to be somewhat human-like, and then monstrous for the beings that people seem to be kind of pushing away, that they're not trying to identify themselves with. So yeah, that was a way of organizing the patchy information that we have access to. And I think it works, but I also don't think it was uniform. So there's this Old English poem, medical text that is labeled with far stitcher.
Right.
Um, so the word stitcher there comes into modern English as stitch. If you go running too quickly, you get what we call a stitch. What it meant in Old English is less clear, but it might have been something really serious, some kind of major pain, a stabbing pain. So this is a medical text against a violent pain, something like that. And that medical text has kind of ingredients that you need for your remedy, but it does also contain a poem that you're supposed to say. And in that poem, we hear about Erza, which seem to be pagan gods, the plural of this word, Ors. Ulva, so are elves, but also Heitasson, which seems to mean witches or something like that, all kind of lumped together as threats. So maybe that's a text in which that distinction between kind of slightly nice otherworldly and slightly freaky monstrous beings doesn't really hold up. And maybe in some circumstances, people were just like, they're all dangerous.
So this is the
Um,
Beowulf poet, yeah.
oh
So
yeah, I guess so.
then I've heard people describe the gods in Old Norse mythology, at least, which I guess it's probably safe to draw at least a few connections here to the primitive the that is the pagan Old English religion, that they are sort of like the allies of mankind against sort of the forces of chaos and darkness. A, is that accurate? And then B, are the elves then kind of also in that category?
Yeah, thanks. Nice questions. And certainly my thinking about elves in Old English was quite influenced by the material that we have in Old Norse, as well as looking at other stuff like Old Irish.
Mhm.
Um, yes. So certainly someone like Snorri Sturluson, who is our kind of uh, late 12th, early 13th century Icelander who writes this text that he calls the Edda, that kind of talks all about kind of what we call Norse mythology. Um, he is setting up a view of the world in which the Aesir, um, the people whose name is cognate with this Old English word Ors, meaning God. The Aesir are human-like. They're flawed, they're corrupt, they have stupid bickering fights with each other, but they're fundamentally like us. And in Snorri's kind of vision of the world, they're then opposed to the Jötnar, the giants, um, who aren't just flawed, but want to kind of bring the god's civilization crashing to the ground. Um, and so it seems like something similar to that might have been going on in Old English speaking culture. Um, but the gods are kind of problematic and capricious. Sometimes they intervene in the human world and cause pain and harm. Um, and we see that in one or two Old Norse poems. Um, so depending on quite how you're relating to the gods at any one moment. You might think of them as, yes, these are just like me, my fine, upstanding friends who are here to protect me and my farm against the kind of threats of ethnic others or other people who are out there. Um, but at other times you might be like, oh, these gods are pretty hard to work with. So I think something like that is going on in early medieval England. And then there's a whole question, debate on which continues to rumble. Sorry, that was a bit of an awkward sentence, but there's a whole question about whether these Aesir, as they're known in modern Icelandic pronunciation, the pagan gods, and the Álfar, the elves, yeah, there's a question about whether and how they relate to each other. So the weird thing is that our friend Snorri Sturluson, who writes the kind of, you know, beginner's guide to the Norse mythology that we all kind of draw on so much, has very little to say about elves. And what he does have to say about elves is demonstrably inspired by a text called the Elucidarium, which is a 12th century beginner's guide to Christian theology. So he's taken some ideas about angels and he's gone, okay, well, that's good. I'm going to import that into pagan, my vision of the pagan mythological world, and we're going to call these angel-like figures Ljósálfar, light elves. But Snorri doesn't really have a place for elves otherwise in his kind of pagan cosmos. And yet, we've got all this Old Norse poetry that talks about Aesir og Alvar, the gods and the elves, as a package. It's a formulaic pair that gets repeated. And that Old English poem with Farstitcher also talks about Ers are your shot or the Ylva your shot. So the shots or attacks of gods and the shots or attacks of elves. So these were clearly a pair. So yeah, for chunks of the early Germanic speaking world, gods and elves clearly came as a package. Maybe they were even the same people. These were synonyms. Maybe they were slightly different people. Um, but that conception of things fades away before Snorri Sturluson gets going. Maybe because different terminology is being used, maybe because the kind of divine world has got a bit reshuffled by the 12th century or so. We're not quite sure. People are still thinking a lot about that. There's quite a lot of debate about who are the Álfar in Old Norse mythology. Was that an okay answer?
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about that elfshot in a bit, but before I ask
Yeah.
that question, I remember reading in your book that Jakob Grimm theorized, this seems like a good theory, but that the word elf derives from alb, that is the same root as Latin albus, meaning like white, and therefore kind of spoke to their sort of upright character. Do you put any stock in that?
Yes, partly. So I think of all the available etymologies for the word elf, the idea that it's connected with Indo-European words to do with whiteness, I think that's plausible. So we've got Latin albus, which means white, but specifically matte white, not shiny white. It's not the same as candidus, which is shiny white. We've got the Old English word ulvet, which means a swan, where the ulv bit comes from this Indo-European word for whiteness. And there are some other Indo-European words too. And it's pretty straightforward to take that Indo-European root to do with whiteness and derive the Old English word, well, the Germanic word elf from that. In which case, etymologically, elves were presumably the white people. And that's not a particular surprise as a kind of euphemism for some kind of god or supernatural being. Whether it has anything to do with their moral uprightness, who knows? And there's also this idea that maybe it's to do with their shininess or it's because they're to do with the sun. I, I'm I wouldn't want to go too far in speculating. That said, I do have an opinion which I nurture but didn't really put into my elves book because I don't think you can. I don't think the evidence is strong enough. But one of the pagan gods in Old Norse is this guy Heimdallr, and Heimdallr gets called Hvítasti Ása, the whitest of the gods, in a couple of texts. And people have really scratched their heads about why he's the whitest. Um, and curiously, in this Old Norse poem Thrimskviða, which is a poem in which the god Thor has to dress up as Freya in
Yeah, it's a
order to
very
pretend.
infamous, well-known story. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So sorry, I don't mean to patronize you or your
No, no, no,
readers.
no, no. The viewers are probably going to be happy to hear.
But in Thrymskvida, Thor has to dress up as Freya to pretend to marry this giant, and Thor is very embarrassed about it because it's impugning his masculinity.
Mhm.
Um, but it's Heimdallr who seems to come up with and endorse that idea. Um, and the word hvítur in Old Norse, meaning white, gets used as a word to describe the beauty of women and children, but not men normally. And it does. There's a little bit of evidence that if you called a man hvítur, you were saying he was cowardly. And so I wonder if Heimdallr, the whitest of the Aesir, is like the campest, the girliest of the Aesir. And that's one reason why he's like, oh, Thor, you'll look so great in a dress. Um, and I wonder if the whiteness of the elves somewhere has something to do with gender transgression, the idea that elves, yeah, were somehow kind of problematic in terms of ideas of masculinity. I just wonder, but I couldn't ever prove it.
Right. I was really fascinated by your kind of discussion of Wayland and or I should say Woland because that's the or Vålundr is that his name in Old Norse?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
Vålundr.
it's nice reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation. All my
Oh.
pronunciations are modern Icelandic, but yeah, great.
Well, the story of him kind of being what was he turned into a swan? I don't remember it particularly. He was
Not
turned into
quite,
some
but
sort
not
of
far.
bird in order to escape his imprisonment, correct?
Well, something like that, yeah. So he meets some swan maidens at the beginning of this Old Norse poem, which I know is Völundarkveða, which is kind of modern Icelandic pronunciation, but yeah, Völundarkveða or something like that in Old Norse pronunciation. So he does meet some swans, and yes, he escapes captivity by flying. In some texts, not Völundarkveða, he definitely makes a flying machine or some kind of apparatus. But he does talk about his webbed feet in Völundarkveða, and that maybe hints that he's transformed into a bird. Um, so yeah, kind of transformation and kind of pushing the boundaries of the limits of the normal human might be something that we're seeing there.
Yeah, and then his kind of then whiteness sort of might kind of suggest and also the fact that he himself is a sexual predator, like he is a sexual
Yeah.
transgressor, might kind of suggest this sort of nefas kind of like not really great, not really respecting these kind of sexual boundaries. Could you speak to that a bit, perhaps?
Well, I think you've articulated some really interesting ideas there. So I don't recall that Vålundr gets called white in Völunndarkveða, though if he does, tell me.
Oh, I
Uh,
thought I read that in your book, so I guess I'm misremembering it.
well, no, it's possible that you did, and I've forgotten it, which is so. I can't remember, but yes. Anyway, if there is a story about an actual elf in medieval Germanic texts, the most plausible example is this. Well, are the stories about Völundr, and specifically this poem Völundarkveða, which does seem to call him a prince of elves or a leader of elves, but the meaning of that bit of the text is slightly ambiguous. So, like if you're a prince of elves, does it mean you are yourself an elf? Maybe not necessarily, but it does seem to be a poem about someone who is an elf, and yeah. If that's the case, then elves seem to be good at metalworking and taking violent revenge and maybe kind of transforming themselves. But the evidence is just a bit tricky. It is, however, an Old Norse poem that is moderately likely to show Old English influence in its language and might have been composed in England. So, of all,
Right,
all our Old Norse poetry, it might be the one that's most likely to tell us about early medieval English
right.
beliefs.
This might be a long shot, but I've been reading Tacitus lately with my viewers, and we recently just covered the part where Tacitus mentions this kind of really confusing phrase that is corpore infamus, that he describes people who are punished by being kind of thrown into the mud or the bog because they are corpore infamus. And I'm aware that even among like the most experienced, well-educated Latinists, it's a little not particularly clear what that means, but it's generally kind of assumed to mean some sort of sexual transgression. Do you think
Oh,
that there might be any sort of connection there? Do you have anything that you could tell us about that?
oh wow. So that is an interesting connection, isn't it? And the short answer is I don't have anything that's going to be more intelligent than what you have to say. Um, but like the early medieval world is a world in which people are very concerned about the boundaries of sexual behavior. Whether that's policing women and their position on the marriage market, um, or policing ideas of masculinity and kind of what is proper kind of gendered behavior. People are concerned um, that sexual threats are out there, and a way to talk about that is to tell mythological stories about supernatural beings having sex with you. Um, and by the time we get into the high medieval period and say the 12th century England-based but French language writer Marie de France, she's sometimes presenting beings that she doesn't label fairies and certainly doesn't label elves, but they're definitely human-like supernatural beings. She's presenting some of them as being quite attractive people who you might want to have sex with. There's a knight called Yoneg who, can transform into a bird and is seen as, sexually a good option by an unhappily married girl. There's a human male knight called Lonval who kind of has a sexual liaison with a female fairy. So Marie was obviously quite happy to write about these stories as in some ways quite positive, and she's kind of saying, yeah, having sex with fairies is pretty cool. But there are clearly quite a lot of other texts out there where you're just trying to say, don't go in the woods, girls. Scary bad things can happen to you. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, I am glad that this has kind of come up because I wanted to talk specifically about this stuff. In your sixth chapter, you of the book that is about on Isles, you write that what we have written on women of the time period of like that, early medieval England is overwhelmingly the history of queens and nuns. In general, I find, in my experience at least, that gender in early medieval England is really difficult to study. What can elves kind of tell us about this?
Yeah. So thanks for asking. And um, I think one of the things that 20 years after doing the research for my Elves book, one of the things I'm least confident about is what we can do with elves and gender. But something is going on. So the So there's this term aporia. It's a term used by Jacques Derrida for kind of weird glitches in the evidence, weird glitches in texts and culture, where you kind of go, oh, something's going on here, even if I don't know what. And so we know that Old English speakers are engaging with all these Latin texts, and they're encountering words for nymphs, like in classical mythology. Um, and they're thinking, okay, how do we translate these words for nymphs into Old English? So the Anglo-Latin poet Aldhelm, for example, or Aldhelm, I should call him really. Aldhelm writes in England Latin poetry that talks about the Muses, for example, and then you get Old English scholars coming along going, okay, how do we explain this to the students? And they're putting in these Old English glosses. And we can see that people consistently look at words for nymphs and they're like, we're going to have to translate these words with words to do with elves. But we see that different translators come up with two different ways of making a feminine form of the word elf. That's a bit odd. It's a bit odd because you'd expect that if people are talking about female elves all the time, there would be like a consistent way of doing it. But two different people take two different approaches to creating a female form of the word elf. Um, And fundamentally, I don't know quite what to do with that. What I thought when I was writing this book a couple of decades ago was that it showed us that really female elves weren't on the radar, that you only really got male elves, but that maybe these male elves were kind of noted for getting up to dodgy magic of the kinds that you might associate with women. So one of our Old English medical texts talks about a thing called alfsiden. What's alfsiden? We don't have this word siden elsewhere in Old English. It looks like it might be cognate with the Old Norse word seidr, which means a form of magic. Um, and our Old Norse texts say that seidr is a thing that is associated with women. Men shouldn't really do it. So if elves are doing it, does that imply that they're not really as manly as as everyday upstanding guys? Um, so was there a situation where elves were a bit girly, they got up to dodgy girly magic, and female elves weren't really on the radar because the whole point of elves was to be kind of male figures who were kind of a bit transgressive and girly. These were things that I was speculating about 20 years ago. And as time has passed, I don't think those ideas are exactly likely to be wrong, but I am even less convinced than I was that you can argue it reliably. But something weird is going on with elves and gender. Elves are your go-to for talking about nymphs, but there isn't a neat feminine form of the word elf to use.
Right. I at least was very grateful to find all of that gloss information. I don't I'm really involved in the spoken Latin community,
All
and
right.
you might be surprised how often I find the need to talk about elves while speaking in Latin, and I'm never really sure what to say. A lot of people just say nymphae. They just refer to them as nymphae. But I was really happy to learn from reading that discussion that the first mention of elves, he just called them alvi, which I think that I'm going to start using that instead. Actually, I think that will be more clear. Like people actually understand what you were talking about if you say alvi.
Well, and there's definitely a rich medieval tradition of kind of weird Germanic loanwords fetching up in Latin
For
that people
sure.
look around and go, well, what are we going to call this?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they're super fun to use.
Um,
Okay, one more thing. I commonly told fun fact I hear goes something like the early medieval English believed that elves would go around shooting people and giving them disease called elfshot, which you've mentioned a couple times already today. It's often used to demonstrate, I think, this kind of perceived primitiveness and superstition of the early medieval English. Is this a misconception?
ooh, thanks for asking. Um, so I said earlier that someone described my book about elves as mostly source criticism, and this is an example of where my answer to you is going to be mostly source criticism. So there are a few things that I'm confident are not to do with elves going around shooting people. Um, we've got a few Old English medical texts that talk about what to do if your horse or cattle, or maybe a person, are in Old English yshotten, which is a past participle that definitely, in some sense, means shot. And so some early scholars looked at this and they thought, okay, well, if you've been shot, it implies you've actually been shot with an arrow or a spear. Who's doing the shooting? And there are literally, like, I'm pretty confident, two texts which imply that elves might cause this yshot. That's the noun, yshot. Um, but I did quite a lot of philological research, and I'm really confident that this word yshot in Old English, although it basically means a shot, like a projectile that you might throw or something. I'm really confident that in Old English and other Germanic languages, it could mean a stabbing pain. Um, a bit like how we talk about people having a stroke now, like etymologically, a stroke is when you strike someone. Yeah. And so if someone's had a stroke, etymologically, they've been struck.
That's a really good
Um,
comparison. I like that. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Um, there are some texts in which you are struck by a supernatural being, and that's where your stroke comes from. But there are lots of texts where you just have a stroke, and it's just the word you use for this, affliction. So I'm pretty sure that the word you shot could mean like a sharp stabbing pain or something like that, and and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being caused by elves. So there was a time when every not only Old English but early modern Scottish text that mentioned someone having a year shot as an illness was thought to be evidence for elves going around shooting people. And I think that's completely wrong. But it is clear that elves could cause that sort of illness. It's in their repertoire of things they can do to you. Um, and that Old English poem or medical text with against a sudden pain or something like that, does envisage elves and Aesir, Aesir, whatever we should call them, and witches causing illness by forging weapons and actually shooting you. And that's a really widespread really widespread conception of illness in all sorts of cultures around the world, that it might be caused by supernatural projectiles. So, um, elfshot as a kind of term is one that bothers me. It kind of makes it seem like there was a really well-defined thing that was called elfshot. I don't think that's true, but I think people could talk about illness as a shot back when, and elves could cause it. And we've got a few texts that attest to this idea, both in Old English and when you fast forward to 17th century Scotland, a couple of Scottish texts as well. So there's clearly some association there, but it's not completely tight thing. If it's a shot, it's done by elves.
Right. The Wikipedia page for Elfshot, I happened upon it when I was doing my homework for this interview, and it really plays up the idea that there were just elves running around the country shooting people and wreaking havoc and stuff like that. I noticed that out of respect for, I'm aware that there's a rule that you're not supposed to put your own research into Wikipedia articles, and I noticed that you had not done that. So I went ahead and actually
Oh, did you?
toned down the level of confidence in this kind of rampant, panic of elves running around shooting everyone. But yeah, it really reflects this kind of idea that it was kind of like. Do you think that that it perhaps has something to do with the fact that people in the 20th century really thought that elves were kind of these like evil mischief makers?
Yeah, absolutely. But first, thanks for doing some Wikipedia editing. It made me. I'm so grateful, and thanks for citing me. I'm chuffed. I do loads of Wikipedia editing, and I do sometimes cite myself,
Oh.
but I hadn't taken that one on, and I didn't. I hadn't. If I'd noticed it, I'd long since forgotten. So thanks. I really appreciate it. It's a good service to humanity. Um, but oh yeah, that's right. So the m largest number of our Old English attestations of the word elf are in medical texts, which is really interesting. Like, amongst other things, that tells you these are serious texts, right? They're real medical texts about how to make people better who are actually ill. And that tells us really clearly that people take elves seriously um, in early medieval England. Admittedly, they sometimes come at the ends of texts and they seem to be a bit marginal. So there is a sense that this is sort of peripheral knowledge, but nonetheless, it's significant. And because elves mostly turn up in medical texts, they indeed got thought about in the early 20th century by scholars of medicine in England. And in the early 20th century, the medical profession was still coming out of, a period where they had hardly any idea what they were doing. Okay, in the early 20th century, clinical medicine is really kind of gaining momentum. And historians of medicine at that time were really invested in ideas of kind of modern scientific progress, which I'm very grateful for. I'm grateful for penicillin and all sorts of useful things and vaccines and things like that. That's all great. But in their enthusiasm to say, "Hey, we're modern. We can fix illness," they did tend to kind of portray the medieval world as benighted and foolish and ignorant. And elves were very much caught up in that. And so it's these historians of medicine who weren't necessarily thinking very carefully about the language of their sources, who started us down this path of conjuring up this idea of these, yeah, demonic little mischievous elves going around shooting people all the time. Um, but there you go. The great early modern Icelandic scholar Árni Magnússon had a lovely phrase, which I don't remember in Icelandic, but in English, it's some people make mistakes and other people fix them, and thus everyone has something to do. So, I'm grateful to these early 20th century scholars for making some mistakes for me to fix.
Yeah, I really liked your discussion on the idea of like a social reality in early medieval England. This idea that, like, for example, today the existence of God is at least up for debate among the average Western society, but in early medieval England, it wasn't. Like it was a reality, at least socially, that everyone just kind of knew. that God was real. In the same way that like even if someone might have not really cared about elves, even if someone might not have really ever thought about it, it was just kind of like real socially for them. I thought that was really interesting.
Um, yeah, and I think for me as someone who works on languages, I'm really interested in the idea that there are some things that we think of as real that we can only think of as real because we have language. So, like numbers might be an example. Humans can maybe count up to about five intuitively. If you look at five objects at once, you can be like, there are five of those. If you have a large number, you're just like, there are many. But because we have language, we can do things with numbers and we can access real reality, like numbers are in some sense real, in a way that we couldn't without language. And I suspect that things that are not kind of tangible, gods or the value of money, can only exist because we have language. And as someone who's interested in studying language, I think that makes some really fascinating categories for research.
Have you read much of Wittgenstein?
Oh, no, I have never read any Wittgenstein, but I do know he does say interesting things about language.
Well,
What do you
that
want?
that's kind of exactly what he says. Is that a lot
Okay.
of he like I think now I'm not a Wittgensteinian scholar, but I think he really capitalizes on Plato and Aristotle and kind of brings the idea of forms into words. That is like
Mm.
if we all have this sort of rough agreement on what a word means, you know, that concept metaphysically, like if we all agree what friendship is, then like that is what like that friendship does exist,
Right.
and it is defined kind of by these like social contracts that or these kind of the words that we use to describe it, that kind of thing. Everyone just kind of knows what a friend is, and so like someone can metaphysically be a friend just because people call them that.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you would really find that interesting then. That sounds
Yeah.
very Wittgensteinian.
Yeah,
Have
thanks. I really appreciate your insights.
Have you done any research on where Tolkien gets his ideas of elves from? Like, 'cause he seems to, from a very young age, to have a very clear idea. Maybe I should say at least by the time he's 30, to have like a clear idea of what an elf is. But it doesn't seem to be in line with like a lot of the other contemporary depictions of elves. I'm not sure if you've done any research on that.
No primary research, and there are loads of Tolkienian scholars who
Mhm.
are more on it with this than me. But do you know the recent, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago, article by Haukur Þorgeirsson in Notes and Queries about Tolkien's elves?
I'm familiar with his work, but not that article.
Oh, yes, I really recommend it. So Haukur has published just this little article in Notes and Queries. It's about 4 pages long, where he says. Isn't it weird that Tolkien's elves are really similar to this early modern Icelandic text about elves? I forget the name of the Icelandic text, but there's an early modern Icelandic humanist who's a Christian. He's like, well, we know that elves are real. How are we supposed to fit them into a kind of Christian humanist view of the world? And he writes this whole treatise about elves. There's an early modern Scottish scholar who does the same, but I won't go down this rabbit hole. But Haukert is like, it's obvious that Tolkien's elves are in some ways similar to what this guy is talking about, but there's no way Tolkien knows this bloke's work. Where's this coming from? And it's coming from the introduction to the main 19th century collection of Icelandic folk stories, Þjóðsögur og Ævintýr, collected by Jón Árnason, I think it is. I apologize if I've misremembered his name. But Jón Árnason collects all these folk stories, many of which are about Huldufolk or Álfar, hidden people or elves. He's got access to that early modern treatise, and he writes this whole thing about what elves are like in the introduction to this 19th century book. Hokert argues, and I'm sure he's right, that young Tolkien sits down, maybe in Oxford, works his way with his Icelandic dictionary through the introduction to this text, and he's like, oh, so that's how elves work. And so there's loads of very scholarly stuff out there on Tolkien's sources for his elves and this kind of thing. But that looks like it's the really big one, the one that really shapes his kind of conception of them. And no one noticed because no one, including me, has gone off to read the introduction to Íslenskar þjóðsögur og ævintýr. And Hauker seems to have nailed it.
That's pretty awesome. I've never heard that before. I'll have to check that article out. You said it's in Notes and Queries?
Yes, and I put a mention of that into the Wikipedia article about Tolkien's
Oh,
elves.
brilliant.
Um,
Okay.
and hopefully, eventually, it will become well established in scholarship, and eventually, the Wikipedia article will properly reflect it. But it's mentioned there.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. You
Thanks.
are, of course, what I would call in Old English, svide lærd on both of the Old English and Old Norse corpora, as well as Middle English. Do you have a favorite in between them?
Uh, yes, sort of. So, Old English is great, and my as an undergraduate, I focused on studying Old English, and I learnt most of what I know about linguistics from studying kind of Old English philology. So it's very dear to my heart. But at the end of the day, it's a small corpus, um, and much of it is sermons. Sermons are great, and there's loads of great things you can do as a scholar with sermons. I'm not here to diss sermons, but, you know, we've got about 30,000 lines of Old English poetry. I mean, is that the length of the Odyssey? Maybe it's the Iliad and the Odyssey. I suspect it's just one. But it's not that much. Whereas there's screeds of material in Old Norse. And Old Norse studies are really buoyant at the moment, which is lovely to see. But at the end of the day, there are more people out there who study Old English than Old Norse. So there's a much more favourable ratio of scholars to available evidence for Old Norse than there is for Old English. There's just more and more interesting work out there to be done. So I'm more excited by Old Norse at the end of the day. I'm also a restless thinker. So the last 10 years or so, I've actually focused a lot on studying Arabic, and that's been a huge eye-opener for me. And if I did my Elves book again, there would be a lot more jinn in it. Um, and so to some extent as well, I think as my career goes on, there's always a challenge of, okay, what's the next language to try and work with? So I went from Old English to Old Norse, and Arabic is where I've been recently.
hmm You're actually the second person to tell me that Old Norse is kind of this like real frontier in scholarship right now. The first was Tom Shippey.
Oh.
And I don't really know what is meant by that. I recently read a really interesting dating of the Poetic Edda that was
Oh.
published 2 years ago by Christopher Sapp. It was brilliantly done. That being said, I've seen that kind of stuff in Old English for the past 2 decades. And I'm not I like what is interesting? Could you give us an example of like interesting modern scholarship in Old Norse?
Yeah, so to me, what's really interesting is that there are still lots of not early medieval, but high medieval Old Icelandic texts that haven't been edited, that hardly anyone has read. Um, there are lots of sagas, so there are lots of very famous sagas set in Iceland, the Íslendingasögur, the sagas literally that belong to Icelanders. Um, but there are lots of Icelandic sagas set in continental Europe, which people haven't studied nearly as much. They've got loads of interesting, wacky stuff that tells you about what's going on in, say, 14th century Icelandic culture. Um, like I say, lots of those haven't been edited or haven't been translated, haven't been studied very much. And then there's this massive corpus of poetry called rímur, rhymes, literally, which gets going in the late 14th century. Most of our texts are from the 15th and 16th century. And so if you're really interested in Vikings, rímur are no use to you. But there are thousands and thousands of lines of this poetry that, again, are often just sitting in manuscripts. No one's studied them yet. So if you're interested in kind of, new problems, that material is fantastic. Whereas, you know, there are loads of editions of Beowulf. We've picked over our corpus of Old English poetry many times. There's still great stuff to say about it. Don't get me wrong. People are doing really interesting new work. But yeah, that you can be more like one of those 19th century pioneers working on Old Norse or indeed Arabic, despite the large number of Arabic speakers, than you can with Old English.
These Old Norse sagas that we have, or I should say, they're you said kind of like the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century. So is
14th.
that still Old Norse? Is that more like Middle Norse, Middle
Yeah, we don't
Icelandic?
really. Well, the thing about Icelandic is that modern Icelandic is still in its old phase. So whereas Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish have changed very dramatically and in similar ways to how English has changed from Old English, Icelandic is still more or less the same as Old Norse. The pronunciation is a bit different. They have words for car and telephone, um, but it really is very similar. There's no Middle Icelandic because grammatically we're still speaking Old Icelandic. Um, and that's another reason why these medieval texts are interesting. They continue to be copied in manuscript into the 20th century. Radio killed the saga manuscript. Um,
Oh,
so
goodness.
there's just all this amazing material that you can study if you're interested in the Old Norse language, even if it's from after the Viking Age. And I recognize that lots of people are really interested in Vikings, but I'm interested in some of the later stuff too.
Is the subject of these sagas like generally the same kind of heroic age material, like, the Huns, the Goths, that kind of thing?
You get some of that. You get a lot of stuff that's inspired by medieval romances about kind of damsels in distress, knights and dragons, but with a kind of distinctively Icelandic take. So there are lots of romances in which the hero, the protagonist, is going to get himself a wife, but she just doesn't want to get married. And she spends a lot of the saga just kind of foiling the hero's efforts to marry her. So, although ultimately these are patriarchal and often misogynistic texts, they often have some female characters with a lot of agency, and they're done differently from how romance gets done in continental Europe. So yeah, so the subject matter isn't always what kind of people who get interested in Old Norse or Old English, um, you know, the subject matter isn't what often initially attracts people to those fields. The ancient battles of the Huns or something like that and the Goths. But it is really interesting and it's doing culturally very interesting work. Um,
Do they
yeah.
use the canons of these like mythological or like semi-mythological? Like, are we seeing like Walter of Aquitaine is the one chasing this woman who you're describing, or is it just someone new, someone made up?
It varies. So you get both.
Mhm.
You get completely fabricated heroes with ostentatiously and implausibly Latinate names. And you also get, yeah, things like Kyrialax saga. So I didn't prep this, so I apologize if I'm
No,
improvising
no
slightly.
worries.
Kyrialax, I can't remember the Greek form, but this is an Icelandicized form of a Greek imperial name. And these romance sagas are often set in and around Constantinople, which has a much more kind of positive representation in high medieval Icelandic culture than normal in the Latin West. In the Latin West, people are normally like, oh, Greek Orthodox, it's not proper Christianity. We don't really like these people. Maybe we'll sack them on the way to the Crusades. But Iceland is like, Constantinople's great. And what we seem to be seeing there are the very distant echoes of a Viking Age culture in which Scandinavians were working as mercenaries in Constantinople. Stories about Constantinople were still circulating in the kind of later medieval Scandinavian world as the place where you go to make your name and where all the cool stuff happens. And we get names that are being picked up from that tradition, like Kyrialax. Really sorry, I can't remember the Greek for that. Um, but that then kind of turn up in these romance sagas. So there are all sorts of what Margaret Clooney's Ross might have called prolonged echoes of the kind of Viking world that go into these later Icelandic texts.
That's really cool. Thank you very much for telling us about that.
Oh, well, thanks for asking. I appreciate getting to talk about it.
Yeah, of course. I think we're coming up on time. Alaric Hall, thank you very much for coming on. Do you have anything else to say to the viewers before we go? I do want
Um,
to mention before we end that you are offering tutoring now on several old languages. That is Middle English, Old Norse, Old English. Any ones that I'm missing? Modern Icelandic, perhaps?
Beginners modern Icelandic. I'm very good at teaching beginners modern Icelandic. And then once you get to a certain level, I'm like, okay, you've got to go and talk to a native now.
For sure.
Um, but yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, so I'm offering private tuition, and people can find that on my website. But no, what I'd like to say is thanks to you for inviting me to talk and for your, really perceptive questions and comments. And thanks to anyone who is listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. All right, guys. This has been Alaric Hall. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and until next time, Fardathie Yasunde. Actually, if you'll permit me to hold you for a second, I want to make some clarifying comments on the Latin phrase that I brought up, corpore infamis. I made two mistakes. One was grammatical, one is just kind of not really giving an accurate summary of what we know about this phrase. The grammatical mistake, pretty embarrassing. I said corpore infamus. That's not a word. The adjective is infamis, 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 infames. So it's not one of these adjectives. Like another one that I brought up was albus, meaning white. That is, a different kind of adjective. We are here working with infamis, infamis, infames is the plural. And literally, the words corpore infames or corpore infamis translates to someone who is kind of considered socially strange or exhibits unacceptable social behaviors or is kind of not in a respectable social class because of their body or with respect to their body. That is corpus. Um, so there is a tradition of, at least in Tacitus, of translating this phrase as kind of like homosexuals. And the Loeb translator gives sexual perverts. Now, that that isn't the worst thing that you could say about it, but it's just not accurate. It's not really an accurate translation, and it has led to a lot of beliefs that there was this kind of hatred of homosexuality in ancient times among the Germanic people, which is just not really like that's not really what we can say of this. Not only is that not really true, at least we can't demonstrate that that's the case. But that's certainly not what's being said here. What is being said here is, at least from a Roman perspective, from a wealthy, educated, upper class, late first century Roman perspective, there was this kind of concept of traditional masculinity and aberrances from that depiction of from that like that garance of traditional masculinity were referred to sometimes as corpore infamis. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who was referred to as corpore infamis was going around, wearing like cross dressing or something like that. It's people who flee from battle, at least apud liwi. I don't know why I just said apud liwi. That isn't even grammatically accurate. In Livy, a deserter is referred to as corpore infamis, and that makes a lot more sense. Because there was this idea of traditional masculinity. There was this concern, as Professor Hall said, of like the boundaries of masculinity and what it meant to be a man and what men should be doing. And anyone who has studied Roman culture will know that there was a big deal, a great emphasis placed on the role of the man as kind of the active, powerful, brave, strong one, and the woman as kind of the passive, soft, malleable one. That is, at least, as far as we can tell, a common conception among wealthy upper class Roman elites of the classical era. Tacitus has a specific agenda in writing the Germania to depict the Germanic people as kind of like really masculine, as really kind of rooted, as really natural, because he has a clear agenda of essentially saying to the Roman people, like, this is what a people look like if they don't have any of this kind of like corrupting cultural influence that we have. We have like nice clothes and good nice things, and we drink wine a lot and we eat a lot, and so we have become kind of like soft and bourgeoisie and kind of like effeminate. We find this idea in Caesar as well. He refers to the Belgians as kind of being more masculine. Or he says that they're more brave, they're braver, they're more warlike. Why? Because they are far away from the things which pertain to, I think his exact words are effeminandos animos. That is kind of like the effeminating effect that these mercantile goods from our culture have on the male Gaul. That is, the ones that are closer to Rome are kind of softer, are easier to fight against because we have influenced them by our effeminate culture to be more effeminate. But the ones that are farther away from us, that is the Germanic, the Belgian people, are more masculine and clearly emulable that is kind of clearly this masculinity is considered a virtue, according to at least Caesar and Tacitus. And so there is not, there is this agenda to depict them as kind of being masculine, natural, not really, not separated from their nature as we kind of like civilized Romans are. Okay, so we've got two problems then with this interpretation that is traditional of just kind of assuming that corpore infamis means like homosexuality. One of them is then that this idea that the Germanic people probably didn't actually think that. They might have had prejudices, and in fact, they almost certainly had prejudices against homosexual people, but those prejudices were probably not the way that we think about it nowadays. It probably wasn't the same as modern homophobia. And then additionally, our perception of those Germanic people is shaped by a Roman author who had a specific agenda to, enforce his own ideas of what was acceptable for traditional for a man to do, both in terms of his martial prowess, in terms of the way he talked, in terms of the way that he conducted himself sexually. Um, so there's a big kind of a wide net of behavior that we're talking about here when we say corpore infamis. Now there is a Old Norse concept. There's a noun that we have called arch, meaning kind of like meaning kind of the same thing. That is a man who is kind of soft, a man who is not he doesn't he's maybe afraid in battles. Maybe he doesn't like talk or act the right way. Maybe he commits sexual what they would consider at least to be sexual transgressions. Um, that was a concept in Old Norse, so it's very possible that that was also a concept in this kind of Proto-Germanic Germanic society, but we don't know. And this is about the best evidence we have for it, and it doesn't really tell us much because hey, it's the term itself is kind of vague. It's coming from a Roman author, and it does map up pretty well with this Old Norse concept of arch, but it's not perfect, and even that is kind of confusing to us. We don't really understand it perfectly. So, in all things, I advise caution when interpreting texts like these. I'm not an expert on this stuff, as may be apparent, and I think that the zeal to translate something like this as kind of, or to interpret something like this as kind of the Germanic people having the same kind of prejudices against homosexuality that modern homophobes do is, I think, foolish. And I think that we should be careful about things like that. Okay, nothing more to say. Sorry for taking up any of your time. I hope that was educational and not just kind of a rant. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the talk. And for real this time, Farathie Yesunde.